Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into source material all about preconception health. Basically, the steps people can take before pregnancy for a healthy baby. Now, the sources, they lay out this comprehensive definition, right? It covers the health of both parents-to-be.
Right. That's the official definition, yeah.
Okay.
But the material flags almost immediately is this big gap in practice.
A gap? How so?
Well, you look at the public health messages, the guidelines, even what doctors often focus on. It's overwhelmingly aimed at the woman.
Oh.
Her health before conception is treated as, the key thing. One source calls it the vigilant womb.
Vigilant womb, I see.
Yeah, demanding all this focus on diet, folic acid, definitely avoiding alcohol, smoking, weight management, checking medications, environmental stuff. It's a lot.
It sounds like a huge checklist. And meanwhile, the dad-to-be.
He often ends up being sort of the invisible man in all this, even though, like you said, the definition includes him.
So the practical advice just doesn't line up with the overall goal stated in the sources.
Exactly. And that's really our mission for this deep dive, based on what we've read, figuring out why there's this imbalance. And maybe more importantly, pulling out the scientific evidence the sources show about the father's role. Because biologically, he's definitely not invisible.
Okay, so let's dive into that evidence then. What's the first big piece that challenges that one-sided view?
One of the most significant things the sources cover is sperm health, but going beyond just count or how well they swim.
Okay.
Specifically something called sperm DNA fragmentation, SDF.
SDF, right. Can you break that down a bit? Why do the sources say it matters so much?
Sure. So think of sperm carrying half the genetic instructions, right?
Yeah.
SDF is basically damage to that DNA.
Damage, okay.
And the sources explain that things like lifestyle choices, a man's age, environmental toxins, even some medical conditions can actually increase this DNA damage.
And the impact. Is it just about getting pregnant?
Well, that's the crucial part, the material highlights. High SDF isn't only linked to infertility, it's tied to higher miscarriage rates, problems with how the embryo develops.
Wow.
And potentially even increased risks for certain birth defects and maybe some later life conditions for the child.
Miscarriage and birth defects. That's way bigger than just conception struggles.
It is.
And the sources also mention advanced paternal age, don't they? How does that fit in?
They absolutely do. The material points out that APA, usually considered over 40, is one factor that increases SDF levels.
Okay, makes sense.
But beyond just the SDF link, the sources connect APA specifically to a higher risk of certain conditions like achondroplasia, that's a form of dwarfism, and maybe surprisingly also some neurological conditions like autism and schizophrenia. The exact how is still being researched, but the correlations there in the studies presented.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, pulling from the sources.
Yeah.
It's not just a child's health. You're saying paternal health can impact the mother's pregnancy too.
That's a really key point and often missed. The material we looked at mentions research suggesting certain paternal health factors might increase the mother's risk for complications like gestational hypertension, high blood pressure during pregnancy.
So it really highlights how interconnected it all is.
Yeah.
It's not just happening inside the womb.
Exactly. It extends beyond that.
Which brings us back to the paradox then. If there's all this science showing the father's significant role, why is the focus still so lopsided?
Yeah, it begs the question about the root causes, doesn't it? The sources argue pretty strongly that this imbalance isn't just, an accident or oversight.
It's deeper.
It seems to be, yeah. Deeply embedded in sort of societal structures, rooted in older patriarchal norms and, frankly, gender bias that historically put the main burden and the blame for reproduction on women.
So it's systemic, not just a lack of information.
That's the argument presented.
Right.
This bias created what the sources call a chasm of knowledge. For a long time, there just wasn't as much research into the male factors compared to the female ones.
Right.
And flowing from that, there's been less public health education aimed at men. So many men are just, unaware of how much their health might matter for pregnancy outcomes, especially things like birth defects or miscarriage. They haven't really been brought into the conversation in the same way.
Okay, so for you listening, understanding this shift isn't just about the science, like SDF or APA. It's really about recognizing, based on these sources, that getting ready for parenthood is fundamentally a team effort, a shared responsibility.
Absolutely. And changing that view is pretty crucial, not just for fairness, but for actually improving outcomes more effectively.
So if we put all these pieces together, the biological impact of dad's health on the child, even on the mom's pregnancy, and then the societal reasons why it's been overlooked, it leads to a pretty big question, Drawing from the material we reviewed, how do we need to fundamentally redefine what it means for both partners together to prepare for starting a family, for creating that next generation?
Yeah, that's something to really think about as you reflect on this deep dive.